Hey y'all, it has been a while. I'm Fan. Welcome to my channel, Sewing with Tay. Thank y'all so much for stopping by today. If you're new here, this is your first time seeing one of my videos. Hey, I make videos about sew-alongs, learning to sew, DIYs, crafting, like mom life, boy mom life, all of those things. Starter lock life. I'm about 6 months in now. So if that's your cup of tea, hit the like button and the subscribe button so you know when I'm making new videos. For today's video, we are going to talk about seam finishings. The number one thing you can do to elevate your handmade, homemade, handcrafted, whatever word you want to use, garments is to make sure that your finishing looks nice and neat. It will really put your handmade garments on a different level. So today we're going to talk about 4 types of seam finishing. The first one being serging or a serger. This requires a separate machine, which I will show you, but this machine is used to finish raw ends of fabrics, and it's also used to sew knits. But there are also 3 other types that do not require you to have a different type of machine. There's one which is called pinking, which only requires pinking scissors, which are really cheap on Amazon. I'll put some links in my description. $10, $15 might get you a nice pair. Another finishing is seam binding. You can make your own binding or buy a strips, or you can buy them at craft stores like Joann's. And then the one that I prefer, the fourth one, there are some other ones out there. The fourth one is French seams. French seams take more time, but they are very, very neat and the number one way to elevate your garment. So let's get into these 4 different types of seam finishing. This right here is my homegirl. So she has 4 threads, she has 4 tension dowels, she has 2 needles, she has a little tray here that collects fabric scraps, has a little knife right there that will cut my edges for me, and we're gonna do a little demo. So for the first demo, we're going to do a serged edges with the seam allowance open. So I'm going to start by serging the edges of my fabric, or this would be your garment. I'm going to start by serging them separately. As you do this, you will have to work on your tension wheels, but I like to keep mine at 4 for the first 2 and 5 for the second, and that usually works for most things that I'm serging. So that was my first side, and now I'm going to do the other side, and it will look a little like this. So you have your 2 pieces there, and since this fabric is the same color on both sides, it's hard to see right and wrong sides, but you're basically just going to line your fabric up, right sides together, line your edges up, and then you're going to stitch your seam allowance 1/2 inch or 3/4, whatever it is that you're sewing. Nothing special, just a regular stitch, straight stitch, lock stitch, whichever term you choose to use. And then once you get it stitched together, your seam, however long that may be. And you can do this for curves. It doesn't have to be a straight stitch like I'm doing here in the demo. And then you're just going to press this open so that your seam is flat. Here is a better view. So this is closed, this is the other side, and you're going to open it up. So that would be your right side of your fabric, and this would be your wrong side, and then you would press this open, just like that. And once it's all pressed, it will lay flat, or you can press them all to one side, but I prefer to press them open. So now we're going to do this the second way. We're going to just put 2 edges together, right sides together, and we're going to make our seam. I'm just doing like a 1/2 inch 5/8 for this demonstration. You're going to do a regular straight stitch just for demonstration purposes, but if for whatever reason you're choosing to do another stitch, the process is still the same. So you're just going to put your seam in, and then once you get done, you're going to go back to my homegirl, the serger. And I'm just taking my time here so that you guys can see and realize halfway through, like, I don't have to show y'all me doing these straight stitches, but it's already in the video. So now we're just going to go over to the serger so we can finish this demo. This here is poplin. So as you can see, it is fraying, which is what you do not want, which is why we are finishing. This is a finishing video. So seams are together, and we're just going to run this under the serger. As you will see there, the knife is there cutting off those fray edges so that it's clean. And make sure you cut your train off on both sides. And this is what the seam allowance looks like with the seam allowance together and then serged. And then you can take this to the ironing board and press it to the left or to the right. So there's seam allowance closed and seam allowance open. So these are the serge samples that I made. So this one, the seam allowance is pressed open. So I sewed my seam, I pressed them open like that. But before I sewed these, as you saw, I serged these edges first and then I sewed them. It's a little messy, but this is just for demonstration. So this is the busted open seam allowance with the serge on both sides. Or you can sew your seam like I did in the second version, and then you can serge both seam allowance layers together. So this is one cleaned finished section for like this, and this is sometimes what you traditionally would see. This is a little bit more time consuming, which would cost more, so you would see these on like more expensive garments. All right, so the next demo I am going to say is the cheapest of the options, and it only requires you to have a pinking shear. So these are, the equivalent of what you would buy for like a crafting project, but these are specific to fabrics. Don't know where I got it or how long I've had it, but this is how you do it. I have my seam already done. And I'm just going to take these pinking shears and I am going to trim away the edge. You can make this closer to the seam or farther away from the seam. I decided to keep a little bit of seam allowance here for the demo because I wanted you to be able to see. But there, I'm not that great at cutting these straight. I don't know how people do it and get the zigzag to be exactly the same all the way down. I'm not that great at it. And this is not my favorite method of finishing garments. But if this is what you have, it is a great way to finish your garments versus not finishing them. So this is what it looks like. And you can do the same thing here. You can press this to the left or press it to the right, or you can press it open if you want. Here is a better view of my pinking shears. I don't know where I got these from. I've had them for a very long time. But these are just like typical zigzag scissors that you would find for like arts and crafts type stuff. So these are what they look like. Very simple. And here is a close up of my pink like seam allowance. So I just sewed my seam and then I cut the edge here. And as you can see, these edges are fraying, these edges are not. So this is another way to finish your seams and make sure that your seam allowance does not fray. My third option is binding, which is using bias tape. This is a double fold bias tape that I got from Joann's. And you can see here, if I can get it open, that's what it looks like. You can also make this yourself, but it is not my favorite thing to do, so I am using store-bought bias tape. You use your bias tape to finish the edges of your seam allowance. So to do that, you're going to open your bias tape and take just the seam allowance. My seam has already been sewn, so I have a 1/2 inch or more like 3/4 on each side of my seam allowance. And you're just going to tuck the edge of one of your seam allowance inside of the bias tape. And what I like to do is stick in about an inch and then put my needle down. And that way I have a little tension on the bias tape and my seam allowance. And then I open up the bias tape and slide the rest of the seam allowance in there so that it's smooth and that it will stitch over um, nicely. You might have to trim some fray. As you just saw me doing, there was some fray that will stick out. So I trimmed away some of the fabric that was already fraying. And then I am literally just attaching the binding, kind of like a sandwich, over my seam allowance on one side. And just like the serging, you have the option to do this on each side of your seam allowance or with seam allowance together and then over both edges. So this one here, we're doing the busted open version. where I'm going to be attaching the bias tape on each side of the seam allowance. This can be tricky. The bias tape comes in different widths, so this is like 1/4 of an inch. You can get this as wide as an inch, or maybe even wider if you go on Amazon or something. This can be tricky, so you need to make sure that the fabric of the seam allowance is all the way inside of the binding. Otherwise, you risk that the fabric will come out of the binding and then it won't be stitched on and it won't be clean finished. So you just have to be careful. This does take a little bit of practice. I would suggest not starting with 1/4 of an inch because even I struggle with 1/4 of an inch. Like maybe a 1/2 an inch double fold bias tape will get the job done um, easier than the 1/4 of an inch, but this is what it looks like to have the binding on both sides of the seam allowance. Same kind of visual as the serger on both sides of the seam allowance. Once you get done, you can just cut off the extra. Typically, the top edge and bottom edge of this will be seamed into something else, so you can easily finish it and not have to worry about more fraying at the top and bottom edge. So this is what it looks like with bias tape on each side of my seam allowance. So now we're going to flip to doing it with both seam allowances together. Same process. You have your seam, you have your 2 layers from your seam allowance, and then you're going to take your bias tape, open it up, and put it around the edge of your seam allowance, kind of like a sandwich, and we're going to stitch this down the same exact way. I like to put it under my foot so that there is something holding it, put my needle down, and then once I get the needle down and into the machine, I suck at lighting, guys. I be trying to move the camera around, so that's why you see it moving. But uh you gonna put the needle down and then we're going to adjust the rest of the seam allowance, the body of the fabric, to slide all the way into this fold of the bias tape, and then we're going to stitch it down. You want to stitch close to the edge, but you also need to make sure that your bias is aligned, because if you stitch too close to the edge and for whatever reason your binding is crooked, it's not going to catch the bottom edge of your binding and it's going to upset you. So try to stitch right in the middle, so making sure that you're catching all 4 or 2, 4, 6, all 6 of the layers that are inside of there. I will say out of the 4, this one I think is one of the more difficult ones. But there is your bias tape binding that's on a busted open seam allowance and a closed seam allowance. The next seam finishing is binding, so it's bias tape. You can buy it at Joann's and Amazon and online places. You can make it yourself by cutting your fabric in a 45-degree angle. I personally don't like making bias tape because I feel like it takes a long time. But you could do this with any type of like colors and prints, so you can make it fun and make it a part of the design. Just not something that I prefer to do. I did not really have the intention on using orange bias tape on this demo. I didn't really plan on using orange fabric, but it was what I had. So when I pulled out what I had, it matches way better than what I wanted to. So this is a nice way to finish a garment if you wanted it to be seamless. But some people also use this method to do like contrast colors. But so happened I had orange fabric and orange binding, things that I did not buy at the same time, but ended up in my studio at the same time. So this is my seam. This is my binding that is stitched on. My seam allowances are together on this version. And then I have another version that has the binding on each side of the seam allowances. So the seam allowance is separated, not together. This is also referred to as a Hong Kong finish. I don't know if people still use that term, but that was what I was taught in college, Hong Kong finishing. So, and I don't know why it's called a Hong Kong. Maybe that's something to Google. But the binding is on each edge of the seam allowance. This is a really expensive way to finish a garment. So just imagine like this being like your center back seam on a jacket and having like a contrast binding here. It's another way to finish your garment. So now the last one, which is one of my favorites, it is a French seam. You're just going to start with 2 layers of fabric, just like you would any other time. I went back and labeled this right side and the right side and wrong side to wrong side. So this is not what you would typically do when sewing. You typically put right sides together, but for French seams, you have to put wrong sides together. So your right sides are going to be facing up and facing down. So once you sew your wrong sides together, you're going to take some nice scissors and you're going to trim your seam allowances down to a quarter, even an eighth if you're that good with your scissors. Trim it down so that you have very little seam allowance left. And then we're going to fold our garment or our fabric so that we now have right sides together. And you're going to have that seam there. So you want to roll those edges till you make sure that your seam is right in the middle and that it's centered, and that seam allowance that you cut will be caught inside of there. So here we're now going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which will have your first seam allowance inside of it, and we're going to stitch all the way down, catching it inside. So that is the reason why we trim it, so you don't have to worry about it sticking out on the right side of your fabric. All right, so here is the wrong side. You can see you have a lip there, and that's what the inside of your garment looks like with a French seam. This is the right side of your garment, so it looks just like all the other seam finishings. So here is my last way to finish a garment, and it's with a French seam. Saw the video, it takes a little bit more time to do. It looks like this. I labeled this wrong side. It's the wrong side, which is the inside, has this little lip here. And then this is the right side. It's very clean, as you can see. No fraying, none of that, because it's a seam. You see the fraying here, nothing on this edge. So this is what your French seam looks like. In my opinion, this and binding are the more elevated, more expensive ways to finish seams on a garment. They take more time to sew, and the bias takes time to make bias tape or buy bias tape, so it costs more. But those things are characteristics of a garment that is more expensive, quote unquote more luxurious. So those are ways to elevate the status of a homemade thing that you're making. So those are my 4 preferred seam finishing techniques. They are all very easy. They're all very simple. I think they're all beginner friendly, so you don't have to be like this very advanced sewist to do any of those things. Adding any of those methods to your homemade garments will definitely take it up a notch, give you another layer of professionalism, and overall just make it look nice. A quote my teacher used to tell me in college, because if you didn't know, I went to school for fashion design. A quote my teacher used to tell me in college was, "A clean garment is a happy garment," meaning there's no frays, the seams in the inside are finished, there's no like jagged edges. So yes, I always sit down in my machine and I sew. A clean garment is a happy garment. But until next time, thank y'all so much for watching my little recap. We're getting into more techniques of sewing. If this is your cup of tea, please hit the notification bell so you know when I'm making new videos, and hit my subscriber button. I really appreciate it. I have gotten so many subscribers over the last 2 months. I really appreciate it so much. But until next time, bye.